A message to Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Keith Rowley. Opposition Leader Kamla Persad Bissessar is absolutely correct that the SOE is too late. An editorial by Professor Wall Street.
Kamla Persad Bissessar's argument stands. The case for early action. Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley's defense of his government's timing in calling a state of emergency, SOE, in Trinidad and Tobago is flawed in both its reasoning and its implications. Opposition Leader Kamla Persad Bissessar is entirely correct in asserting that an earlier declaration of the SOE could have saved lives. Her stance highlights a fundamental truth about governance in the face of crises. Timely intervention can make the difference between mitigation and disaster. The case for early intervention. Prime Minister Rowley's argument that murders cannot be entirely eliminated under an SOE is, in essence, a straw man. No one expects that any singular measure would eradicate crime entirely. What Persad Bissessar argued, and what holds weight, is that an earlier implementation of extraordinary measures could have curtailed the escalation of violence and destabilization. The very purpose of the SOE is to disrupt criminal networks and provide law enforcement with the tools and time to regain control over a deteriorating situation.
The data from the 2011 SOE, while not perfect, supports this point. There was a significant drop in murders during its implementation, from 485 in 2010 to 354 in 2011. While the numbers rose again after its expiration, the temporary relief during the SOE underscored its potential to arrest runaway crime. This is precisely what Persad Bissessar highlighted. The earlier the intervention, the more lives and livelihoods that could have been spared.
Rowley's excuse falls short. Dr. Rowley's defense that the government was reluctant to impose an SOE earlier to minimize disruptions for law-abiding citizens rings hollow. The escalating crime situation, including brazen attacks in front of police stations and the orchestration of gang violence across the country, had already created an environment of fear and instability for the public. By delaying the SOE, the government inadvertently allowed criminal elements to entrench themselves further, putting more citizens at risk. Additionally, Rowley's claims about the financial and reputational costs of an SOE are short-sighted. Yes, an SOE may deter certain investors or disrupt some sectors temporarily. However, the unchecked spread of violence has far graver and longer-lasting economic and social consequences. Cruiser ships canceling visits and businesses hesitating to invest are not solely the result of an SOE declaration. They are reactions to the perception of a country unable to control its crime problem. Leadership requires bold decisions. Governance demands tough, sometimes unpopular decisions. In this case, the government's hesitation reveals a failure to act decisively when the nation needed it most. Rowley himself admitted that criminals had reached a point where they operated without fear of law enforcement. This admission underscores the urgency that should have informed his government's actions much earlier. The Prime Minister's claim that God alone knows what would have happened if we hadn't intervened inadvertently supports Persad Bissessar's argument. If intervention was inevitable, why wait until the situation deteriorated further? If the government ultimately recognized the necessity of an SOE, earlier action could only have improved the odds of containing the violence before it reached crisis proportions. Moving beyond excuses. Rather than dismissing Persad Bissessar's claims as conjecture, Dr. Rowley should acknowledge the merit in her argument. An SOE is not a panacea,
but it is a critical tool in the fight against crime. Its earlier application could have provided the police and defense force with the breathing room needed to preempt some of the violence and restore a sense of safety to the population. Crime is indeed a complex issue, and no single measure will solve it. However, leadership is about taking proactive steps to mitigate harm, even when those steps carry risks or costs. The lives lost during the delay in calling the SOE are a stark reminder of what is at stake. Dr. Rowley's government must take responsibility for the consequences of its inaction and learn from this failure. In conclusion, Kamla Persad Bissessar is right to call out the government on this issue. While no one can definitively quantify the lives that could have been saved by an earlier SOE, the argument for timely intervention in the face of escalating violence is undeniable. Dr. Rowley's attempt to deflect blame and minimize the impact of the delay is not only unconvincing, but also dismissive of the genuine concerns of citizens living in fear. The government must prioritize decisive, timely action over hesitation and excuses if it is to effectively address the crime crisis facing Trinidad and Tobago.